So welcome everybody. I'm delighted that we're here for our second in our series of Talking Sustainability with some of our wonderful sustainability working group members. And I'm delighted to welcome Jo Jackson, who is Director of Thames Valley for SEGRO, who's going to host the conversation today with Klaus Dodds, Executive Dean of the School of Life Sciences Environment and Professor of Geopolitics at the Royal Holloway, University of London. So Jo, over to you.
Thank you. And hi, everyone. We're at SEGRO really pleased to be part of the Sustainability Working Group. Responsible SEGRO is a main part of our strategy around sustainability, as well as other ESG elements. But I'm delighted to be joined by Klaus here today to talk about geopolitics and sustainability. And Klaus, I might just get you to kind of give a quick intro to you before we get started.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. And again, it's also a great pleasure to be joining you and anybody else who may listen to this in due course. So yeah, my name is Klaus Dodds. I have worked for the last 30 years on geopolitics and various parts of the world and topics. Much of my passion still remains with the polar regions. So I've done a lot of work in person and beyond in the Arctic and the Antarctic. But I've also always had an interest in environmental sustainability, and I just happen to be the university's lead on that particular topic. So we're going through our own sort of sustainability revolution. But at the same time, also because I've had various external roles with Parliament, the UK Parliament, for example, with NATO, and also worked with various businesses, I've always been interested as well in terms of how environmental sustainability and geopolitics intersect with one another.
Great. Well, it sounds like we're in very good hands today. Lots of expertise there, Klaus. So let's just kick off initially with sort of perhaps how you just perceive the current geopolitical megatrends that are sort of shaping the international landscape, and then really kind of what implications that they carry for kind of long-term sustainability and security planning.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. It feels to me a kind of propitious moment actually to be thinking about these things. I think one way of answering the question is to kind of think about where we were, say, 30 years ago, and then rapidly bring us up to the contemporary moment. 30 years ago, we were, at least in Europe and North America, reasonably confident that in the aftermath of the Cold War, more and more countries and regions around the world would seek to become more like us. They would seek to become more liberal democratic. They would embrace the market economy. Neoliberal globalization, as it's termed, would be something that would be a shared project. And trade, investment, people, ideas would sort of flow freely across borders. And that was before the internet. And even when the internet was being rolled out, let alone before social media took hold, there was really also a widespread belief that the internet would be a force for good, that it would hold authoritarian governments to account. And in one form or another, that also might actually be beneficial for things like environmental sustainability, because although it seems a long time ago, in 1992, we had the Rio summit, and there was a sort of feeling of optimism that finally the environment, if you will, had had its moment. Okay, so let's then fast forward to the current day. Where are we now? Well, I think first, geopolitics is very much back. I don't think it ever went away, by the way, but I do think business, government, academia, media, the general public, I think probably would have a shared understanding that geopolitical issues seem to be making themselves felt very, very keenly. And, you know, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Gaza, China, Taiwan, whatever, there is a sense in which we're at a really quite geopolitically fraught moment. I think secondly, what's become obvious to many people is that geoeconomic power seems to be shifting ever more decisively towards Asia, and certainly in that 30-year period, we now obviously have to recognize China as an absolute geopolitical and geoeconomic superpower. But it's also obvious in terms of population trends. The world is changing. Europe, North America appear in places to be depopulating. Africa, in particular, alongside Asia, clearly going to be really, really important in terms of shaping the current and future world. The growth of the middle class, for example, will be largely based in Africa and Asia. Thirdly, 30 years ago, we weren't talking about artificial intelligence. Hard to imagine a conversation that doesn't talk about artificial intelligence, automation, and really profound technological change that I think will either cause huge excitement or terror that a whole suite of jobs will no longer exist. And the final two things, I think you'd expect anyone to conclude at this point, we have to talk about climate breakdown, not climate change. I think we really do have to get to grips with the climate and biodiversity crises, plural, that we are facing. And I think, unfortunately, look like is only going to worsen if we don't really take dramatic action. And then finally, on top of all of this, whether we like it or not, we're going to need more resources. So whether we're decarbonising, whether we're thinking about low carbon futures, or whether we're simply meeting the demands and expectations of those middle classes, for example, amongst others in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere, we're going to be asking more of the earth. And all of that might lead to, unfortunately, to more resource competition. So we've got a lot of challenges, I think, in front of us.
And it feels like it's taking a long time on some of the sustainability initiatives to sort of, get where we need to. Perhaps feels like slow progress at points. We've been talking about it for a long time. Yet, yeah, when you reference sort of things in the 90s, or it really wasn't that long ago. And actually so much can change so quickly, can't it? Things like kind of, the internet, AI, all those things that are just kind of changing really rapidly.
Yeah, but I think also it's important, again, not to be dystopian about all of this. I mean, let's also remember some of the extraordinary positive changes. So, for example, just to be parochial for a minute, the UK energy mix at the current moment is utterly unrecognizable from what it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we would still be talking about oil, coal, gas. 30 years later, we're talking about a renewable energy revolution. So there have been these kind of moments of extraordinary change. I think, for example, there's more and more recognition that we will have to take seriously things like plant-based diets and lifestyle changes. I think we're in a better place with regards to active travel and more humane cities, recognizing that the world is going to continue to urbanize. And I do think, and I have particular optimism with the younger generation, that actually words like climate justice, I think, resonate in a way they clearly didn't 30 years ago. And I do think, notwithstanding all those challenges posed by those mega trends, I genuinely think there is an appetite, if you will, for that kind of positive change. And for all the, the concerns we might have about social media, I think we have seen an extraordinary democratization, if you will, of the public sphere. There may be elements we don't care for, of course there are, but it does mean I think environmental sustainability is being far more debated, talked about, argued over than it was 30 years ago.
Yeah, agreed. And from a real estate perspective and kind of SEGRO's perspective, things are really changing, and it is good to kind of celebrate those, as you say, those kind of positive and those successes that are out there. And our mandatory sustainability policy on all new developments, we have to put kind of solar on there. We have to kind of get EV charging in. We've got to think about different ways in which that happens. But Klaus, if I could just take you back to one of those points that you kind of raised at the beginning, and you talked about resource competition. In what ways do you believe that resource competition, I think particularly in energy and the food sectors, which you've touched on a little bit, is impacting those geopolitical dynamics, and how should nations sort of navigate those challenges to ensure that sustainable development? And I suppose those different populations that are growing in different areas and very different to how we thought it might happen.
Yeah, no, again, these are really, really important areas of consideration. One way of getting into this is actually, I think, sometimes just thinking about when things go wrong, or when things, for example, prove troublesome. then I think it gives you sort of some indications about, for example, how vulnerable our supply chains can be, particularly in food. So 2 examples. Number one, the Ukraine-Russian conflict demonstrated that actually, if you disrupt the maritime traffic in and out of Odessa in the Black Sea, that has real world consequences for grain and oil shipments going elsewhere in the world. And we quickly discovered that actually places in Africa bore the brunt of that disruption. Now, we could also then offer another example of when a ship gets itself stuck in the Suez Canal, as happened a couple of years ago, the extraordinary ramifications on global trade, because whether we like it or not, 90% of global trade is made possible by the movements of shipping. So that's one sort of aspect to this supply chain vulnerability. Another might be, and again, I think recent events have made everybody think a lot harder about this, is how much food, for example, let alone energy, do we produce domestically? And what does that mean, therefore, that if we are dependent on others for food and energy, whether it's oil, gas, and whatever? And again, I think Europe has also had to confront some sort of powerful geopolitical lessons in all of this. On the upside, however, it's also proven quite remarkable, actually, how quickly Europe or Western Europe lost its dependency, for example, on Russian natural gas. And actually, so one of the things that I think food and energy, because they're so fundamental to our everyday lives, reveals is both vulnerabilities, but also the potential for change. And I think one of the things we shouldn't lose sight of, particularly in the UK, but it would be also true elsewhere, is how we can make our food supply more resilient, and what we clearly will need to do in terms of either enhancing domestic production, addressing waste, encouraging a more circular economy, and actually thinking about whether we need to shift the way in which we use our land, which I think is an absolutely vital, if underappreciated, resource going forward. And on top of that, if that wasn't challenging enough, we've just got to recognize that our climate and our biodiversity will continue to change in the coming decades. So what we thought was possible now may not be possible in 10, 20 years' time, as we have to deal with the two challenges of either too much heat, and secondly, and simultaneously, potentially, too much water.
Yeah, or not enough water in the
or
right
not enough
parts of the
water at
world,
all.
or in the right part,
Or the
yeah.
wrong time of the year.
Yeah.
And so it goes on. So I think, again, this kind of resilience is going to be exceptionally important.
Mm-hmm. And I think we've all seen certainly all the rain that we have in the UK recently, and that will have an impact on what is happening kind of here in terms of food production this year, and be lots of impacts felt locally for sure.
Yeah, and farmers have already reported that, haven't they? That we've had our wettest winter on record, and we will feel those ramifications. So whether we as we continue to deal with, for example, trade flows within and beyond Europe, that's one thing. But I think we've just got to be alive to the fact, and that's why some of the recent conversation in the UK about national food strategies, again, was so important, because I think it's really vital that the kind of population more generally understand that you can't take food security for granted. And I think we learned that, didn't we, through some of the disruption caused by the pandemic, that we've got to be a lot more attentive, I think, to those supply chain connections, and really understand that actually what we can't do. And again, this is the big shift from 30 years ago. 30 years ago, we would have almost had this naive faith that globalization will somehow have this self-perpetuating momentum that means in the end we won't have to worry about it. The goods, the trade will make their way through. We just, I'm afraid, can't have that sort of optimism anymore. I think that would be really unwise.
But as you said, it's amazing actually when we put our minds to it, whether that be in terms of the pandemic, whether that be in terms of reaction to sort of Ukraine-Russia war. It's amazing actually how resilient we can be and how quick we can make change when we need to. So hopefully those kind of examples help us continue to make change.
Yeah, and I think I think this is one of the challenges for government, for business, industry, civil society in general. On the one hand, we want to stress, and rightly stress, long-term planning, and move away from the 5-year electoral cycle that I think often bedevils liberal democracies. But on the other hand, sometimes I'm afraid we need crises to force us to act decisively and actually to make the change that, you know, many of us would recognize we need to make. And that might be about diets, it might be about travel patterns, it might be about taking seriously how we use things like subsidies, tax breaks, incentives. And actually, one of the things we need to do around energy, I think, is just be very clear that actually if we're offering subsidies to oil and gas, that on the face of it, that might have some logic when energy security is invoked. But in the end, that's not what we need to be doing. We need to continue on that renewable energy journey. And that also might mean confronting difficult issues, like if we want more, for example, onshore wind power capacity, that means we're going to have to make essentially trade-offs. And I think that's, for me, one of the key things about a lot of the things we're going to have to get comfortable with and be straightforward about is these are trade-offs. These are not easy win-win outcomes. And I think we need to be ready in the UK and probably elsewhere to have those really quite mature conversations where actually, there are no easy outcomes. There will be, but they will be necessary ones.
And the prioritization that actually, against kind of, the climate and the globe, actually that's got to be the priority over perhaps some other priorities that others may have.
Yeah,
So,
yes, I agree. Sorry, and I think, Joe, on that, I think that's a really important point. I think that's where we also get into conversations about, how we balance out economic growth with environmental sustainability.
mm.
And it may well be that actually we need different kinds of growth that is more ethically, environmentally responsible and sustainable, as opposed to growth at any cost.
And I think we're starting to see that, aren't we, in terms of lots of sort of products or supply chains, or kind of, from consumers kind of all the way through to kind of multinationals that, need to have that kind of ethical sustainability element, those ESG credentials that need to be there for actually business to happen.
I agree, and I think, and again, I think it's one of the challenges, I think, for business, industry, government, and civil society is to be really clear that if that ESG agenda matters, then it really matters in the sense of holding sectors to account, being also prepared to have, again, mature conversations about pricing and availability, amongst other things. And also recognizing, and this will be, I think, a challenge for both private and public sector organizations, you will be held to account. And I think there's something important there about scrutiny, about transparency, and being very, very clear, particularly, if you're a public sector organization, and I include universities in this, we are increasingly going to be held to account by our staff, by our students, but also wider civil society.
And I guess actually just sort of leading on for that, how actually does this kind of form its way kind of into governance, and how do some of the sort of the considerations we've talked about around sort of geopolitical decision making kind of processes at various levels, from individuals through to kind of, at a more global level, how actually do they get integrated to kind of foster sort of more effective and legitimate governance that kind of comes out around these issues?
I think that's a really important topic. Again, in the 1990s and 2000s, there was quite a lot of interest in so-called good governance. And I think one of the things that sort of came out of that was a concern, particularly in the global south, that actually some of this good governance discourse was being sort of deliberately targeted in some parts of the world as opposed to others. And I think one of the pushbacks was that if we're concerned about good ESG governance, if you will, if I can put it like that, then it applies to all of us. You can't be selective about this. I think within industry and business, I think one of the challenges is going to be increasingly is to integrate increasingly the concern around geopolitics with environmental sustainability and good governance in this particular space. And I suspect you're going to increasingly see more and more effort being made to explore where those nexus points are. That might mean, for example, more and more effort being devoted to building genuine competencies in areas like geopolitics. It might be using things like risk registers in ever more sophisticated ways, where you actually really start to try and capture where geopolitical risk will make itself felt. That, by the way, can easily scale up from the individual to the global. Let me give you an example. I think one of the ways that's been really interesting about the Israel-Palestine issue is actually how quickly that can make itself felt, both for the individual, depending on, for example, their sort of ethnic, religious heritage, citizenship. It can also then quickly become national, even if Israel-Gaza might, on the face of it, be far, far away because we live in very multicultural, cosmopolitan societies. But it also will make itself felt both regionally and globally. And that may well also have ramifications through business and individual businesses and individual industries as well. Likewise with Ukraine, Russia, where, for example, companies have found themselves having, in some cases, to negotiate sanctions or in some ways face decoupling their business with the Russian Federation. So I think it's really important to understand vulnerabilities, risks, as well as challenges and opportunities. And there will be trade-offs, again, both individually and beyond, moving through those particular scales. So I think it's really important to say that geopolitics is not something that just happens somewhere else. Geopolitics is not just global. It's actually something that is perfectly capable of making itself felt from the individual and beyond. And I don't, by the way, see it as a kind of vertical scale. I see it very much horizontally embedded, integrated. In some ways, it's actually quite subtle and not, as I say, something you can just talk about in rather distantiated ways.
Mm. And in your opinion, Klaus, what role do kind of the non-state actors, so NGOs, multinational kind of corporations, play in shaping those geopolitical dynamics, and also then kind of promoting some of those sustainability goals, or some of those things that kind of can be done then on a global scale?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because the non-state sector or context is incredibly varied. So, you might, for example, think about in the context of environmental sustainability. Well, one area might be to highlight is the role which non-state actors play in agitating or demanding change. So, whether it's, for example, pressure groups, campaign groups, making themselves felt in capital cities or perhaps in particular sites of potential mineral extraction or whatever it might be, there's usually a demanding agenda. In the UK as well, we've seen only too clearly what happens when protesters, for example, block roads, for example. So there is that element. A second, of course, is and this is obviously where the non-state sector plays a crucial role, is the promoting and the championing. And actually where we're not just demanding and agitating, but actually saying, look, these are things that we think would bring about positive change. And I think we've often seen that in areas, as I say, around environment and sustainability, or responding to the climate crisis. A third will be, of course, is where non-state actors play a really useful role in partnering or enabling or collaborating or potentially improving. So, for example, it's quite common for industry or public sector organizations to work with non-state actors, potentially to get them to play a part in doing things that perhaps those sectors can't do as well themselves. And that might be around environmental sustainability auditing, for example. might be about trying to help create baseline data from which then those organizations can devise better long-term environmental sustainability plans or strategies. So I think it's really important to say that the non-state actors in all of this can play those different kinds of roles, and also acknowledging there's plenty of diversity within that sort of term in its own right. So I think it's really also important to say that it's not straightforward. Just when you say the non-state actors, it doesn't mean that everybody shares the same environmental sustainability agenda. They may not.
Mm. Mm. And I suppose, something that we've seen through the sustainability working group here with Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce is that actually just kind of companies coming together as part of that working group and sharing kind of what they're doing each individually. And sometimes it's just sharing of that knowledge or talking about it to spark ideas and spark initiatives that then kind of grow from that.
Yeah, and I think that sounds to me incredibly wise as an approach. And I think the other thing, which is, which I'm sure the working group also epitomizes, is that willingness also to tackle or stress test potential groupthink. I mean, I think it's really vital that we also, all of us, are open to positive challenge. I don't think anybody has a monopoly of wisdom when it comes to environmental sustainability. And I also think environmental sustainability is always political with a really big P, but it's also with a small p as well, in the sense that a lot of this will feel very emotively charged, and that there will be things that people latch onto and actually feel very strongly about. But it is also political with a big P, in the sense of governments in the end also are absolutely critical in creating that sort of enabling context. And that's why I come back to things like tax breaks, incentives, subsidies. If we continue to subsidize industries and sectors where we probably ought not to with regards to the climate and biodiversity crisis, then we're clearly creating a context of sorts. And we just need to be clear about that, why we're doing what we're doing. And in the end, also, when it comes to things like, for example, infrastructural projects, clearly national governments are going to be vitally important in making those kind of long-term investment decisions. We saw that with HS2. When government pulls support away from it, that's very, very difficult for others to step into that gap.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps if we just go back to some of the part that we talked about kind of near the beginning around kind of some of the technological advances, so AI, and when we kind of consider that in the interplay that kind of between kind of AI and say energy consumption, how actually kind of should some of these policymakers balance that innovation with the environmental concerns to kind of promote sustainable development?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it's really important that, and I think this came through, by the way, very nicely. There was a Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce debate on AI at Windsor Castle, which I attended and thoroughly enjoyed. And I think what was really welcome about that debate on AI was there wasn't a kind of AI techno-optimism throughout the day, that actually participants were perfectly capable of being very critical and nuanced about AI, and not seeing it as the thing that will radically transform everything and anything. Now, it's not to say that AI will not be transformative, because it patently already is. But it is also worth saying that AI is very energy intensive. And so the idea that AI doesn't come with an environmental sustainability price tag would be very naive. And certainly, personally speaking, when I offered a few comments at the end of the day, I also pointed out that I'm afraid, whether you like it or not, AI is being put to work in military and security contexts as well. And we do need to just, as always with technology, just be very, very self-aware that there are always these dual use capabilities, some of which we might lionize and celebrate, and some of which we just need to be very, very cautious about. And I use the example of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict to make that point about AI having, a rather Janus-faced quality to it. I think the other thing as well is just again to bear in mind is that technology is not going to save us in splendid isolation. In the end, there are going to be political, economic, cultural conversations and investments we're going to need to make in order to ensure that our societies are sustainable, but also equitable and livable in some sense. None of this, I think, as I say, can be thought about without that sort of broader hinterland, if you will. And I think that was one of the things that came out of that Windsor debate really, really well, even if colleagues were quick to point out, some of the educational, business, commercial advantages that AI offered.
I mean, there's no doubt that we can't avoid it at the moment. It's definitely going to kind of be part of things, but it is people that make decisions, and technology and AI may help that.
Yes.
Or may provide you with the data to sort of make those decisions, but you still do need the decisions to be made, which won't be being made by kind of AI or tech or anything else, and or whether that be the policy, whether that be those things that come with it as well.
Yeah, and I think also this is where some of the sort of ethical legal debate is so important. And so again, if you'll forgive me for making reference to the Windsor debate, because it was a really good debate, that also came out very strongly. And I think again, several participants made the powerful point that data is not politically neutral, that actually technology again comes with it or brings with it, sorry, a raft of other concerns. And we really do have to be up for that conversation about what is ethical AI, what is legal AI, because actually in the end, what you don't want, and this is why I think there is such a concern around autonomous weapon systems, for example, is that actually, we don't want to get in a situation where there isn't a kind of human agency and responsibility attached to this, because otherwise, where does that leave things like international humanitarian law or the kind of the ethical and legal frameworks that we think are important in shaping the way in which we do business with one another, even when we go to war, let alone where we hope to create more environmentally sustainable futures.
There's a lot of interplay that kind of happens kind of around those things. It's not just the simplicity of kind of one thing, is it? It kind of all comes together.
I agree. And again, I think I referenced earlier the point about nexus. Another way of thinking about it is through the intersectional. And so, yes, I think it's virtually impossible, in my opinion, to have a sensible conversation if you're not thinking about those intersections.
Yeah. And so we touched on this a little bit earlier, I suppose, in terms of what the Sustainability Working Group has been doing around kind of examples. But perhaps, Klaus, you have some examples of initiatives or policies that successfully integrate sustainability and geopolitics. And perhaps also then, I guess, importantly for kind of those that will be listening to this, what lessons can kind of be drawn from those for future planning and implementation?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I was thinking about actually with regards to this particular issue in terms of what would be a large scale example, and that people who might be listening to this would be, I think, potentially familiar with in one form or another. And actually the one I chose was President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act, which is on the face of it an act that doesn't really address inflation actually, but what it does do profoundly is through a series of measures and huge sums of money potentially. I've seen some estimates run to as much as $1.6 trillion, is to provide an extraordinary package that actually deals with infrastructural investment, environmental investment, potential benefits to health, using a raft of measures from direct investment to tax rebates, subsidies, stimuli packages, incentivization, bringing in private financing. It's quite an act in that sense. And I think why it's important is because it does a number of things. One is that it focuses very much on emissions, emission reduction. And I think that's, in my opinion, smart, because what it does is it reframes the political debate. And one of the reasons why President Biden was able to get congressional support was because it was framed as about emission reduction and about enhancing America's energy and infrastructural security. And it had less focus on climate change, which in some cases triggers Republican voters and congressional representatives, who some of whom unfortunately might think of it as a gigantic hoax. So one of the things that I think I take away from the Inflation Reduction Act, and this is obviously a grandiose example, is that actually framing matters. So in other words, that because we live in politically contentious times where we don't all agree what is the best approach to climate change. You know, I've used the term climate breakdown. That won't land well with some people as opposed to others. We don't all agree what words like sustainability mean or why it matters. You've got to therefore think very carefully about how you can reframe things that actually, in the end, bring a substantial portion either of your political class or your society with you, because in the end, what we can't afford is lots of internal schism and division, and that in itself ending up causing a form of paralysis, if you will, institutionally speaking. So I think that's one lesson I would take away from all this. So political framing matters, and you have to bring a diverse series of measures together in order to make substantive change. I think a second thing I would take away from all of this, and now this is more local to where I live, which is London. So this is my other example. Now, for a lot of Londoners, if you mention ULIS, you won't necessarily engender a huge amount of enthusiasm or support. But I think one of the things that Mayor Khan did, which I think was clever, and indeed he's just been elected for a third time, so it clearly has worked to a certain extent, is he resolutely, despite all the contestatiousness around the issue, kept framing ULIS as a health measure. And as a measure designed to tackle air pollution in London. And in that sense, he would have had the implicit or explicit support of hospitals like Great Ormond Street that have absolutely been clear that air pollution has deleterious consequences, in particular for poorer Londoners. And we have to take it seriously. So again, it's partly about my framing point, that framing matters, but I'm absolutely convinced that if we're going to get broader public support for potentially profound transformation in the way in which we organize our lives and economies, we have to frame things as health related. Because I think, as we discovered also when we get it, for example, periods of extreme heat, we know the elderly, the vulnerable, and young people suffer disproportionately. And I really think, in a way, one of the most useful things we can do to keep our focus on environmental sustainability is to constantly think of it as a public health challenge, and that it actually helps none of us if we don't take seriously these kinds of challenges that I think the vast majority of us know we have to confront. So those would be my two examples rather. And I'd also say in both cases, although politically contentious, I think in the end they were driven by the right kind of impulse, which is trying to think longer term, even if in the short term it didn't necessarily engender a great deal of popularity.
Yeah, two very different examples, but really, really interesting points there, Klaus. Well, look, I mean, kind of a huge topic, really, isn't it? Kind of the title for this event of geopolitics and sustainability, and we've covered kind of quite a bit of ground as we've gone through. Are there any other sort of final comments that you might like to sort of make just before we wrap up?
Thank you. Again, I mean, thank you for all the questions and the provocations. I mean, I hope it's clear from what I've said that whether we like it or not, we can't think of environmental sustainability in isolation, and increasingly we're going to have to take the geopolitical elements of environmental sustainability very seriously, because they very rapidly touch upon other things like energy and food security, and those megatrends that we started off with. They're not going to diminish in importance. If anything, they're going to intensify. And we just need to be comfortable with the fact that, we will have a world of about 10 billion people. We think it will stabilize at about 10 billion, but we are going to have a couple of billion extra people on the planet. And as environmentalists said, as far back as the 1970s, we only have one Earth, and we just need to keep reminding ourselves this. I think the final thing I would say is about some of the other implications for industry, business, as well as public sector organizations like universities. I mean, we will need to take very seriously how we continue to stress test our governance in this space. I think whether we develop enhanced capability so we're able to make better judgments around geopolitics, I would suggest is probably crucial. Using our risk registers responsibly, I think, is another mechanism. But we also have to be comfortable with the fact that we're increasingly going to be put under more and more pressure to be transparent, to be accountable, to be responsible in this area of environmental sustainability. But I also, on an optimistic note, I also wouldn't doubt whatsoever our capacity to be creative and to be innovative. And I think that's really important to hold on to. And certainly as an educator, I feel it profoundly important that particularly the students I encounter, that I absolutely want them to come away with a strong sense that there's a future here to be made, and that actually it's not something that is just going to be made or imposed upon them. And I think that for me feels incredibly important. So I really welcome the kind of work the Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce is doing through its working groups, through Windsor debates. I think it's a powerful reminder we still have plenty of agency, and there are, we don't just have to fall back on structural forces that we can't shape or potentially stop. And again, that comes back to the political, both big P and small p.
Yeah. That's great. And Klaus, I think that there's lots of learning to kind of be done, isn't there? And lots more that kind of can be done, but lots more people that are wanting to be responsible, wanting to kind of do the right thing. And that feels like a real shift that's kind of come through in the last few years, which is really positive. And as you say, things like what the Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce are doing here with the Sustainability Working Group, with things like the Windsor debates, it's just bringing more and more businesses together. So actually they can kind of start making some of this change and, kind of being the responsible businesses that they want to be, and understanding how they can make that change.
Yeah, I agree.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Klaus, for joining me today to go through this. And it's been a really fascinating time that we've spent going through that. So thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure. And thank you again for the invitation.